On a solitary stretch of Pacific Coast Highway in California, the landscape was a breathtaking display of contrasts. The deep blue of the ocean blended seamlessly with the rugged cliffs and rolling hills that lined the route. It was a road known for its beauty and for the introspection it could inspire. Making his way along the scenic route was Jonathan Jack Mitchell, a wealthy entrepreneur with a taste for adventure and owner of a sleek Harley-Davidson CVO Road Glide Limited. Dressed in a custom leather jacket and polished riding boots, Jack embodied the polished confidence of someone who spared no expense on life's luxuries. The roar of the engine and the rush of wind against his face were his favorite escapes from the demands of his high-powered life. As he cruised along the highway, a nagging thought broke through his enjoyment. Will I ever meet the perfect woman to share this journey with? His idealized vision, beauty, sophistication, and glamour was as polished as the motorcycle he rode. But somewhere beneath that veneer was a longing he couldn't quite define. Suddenly, a deep, resonant voice on his bike's stereo interrupted his musings. The radio was tuned to a talk show, and the host was reciting an old proverb: "True beauty is found in the one who teaches you to see beyond what the eyes perceive." Jack frowned, momentarily unsettled by the eerie relevance of the words, but before he could shake off the thought, his Harley emitted a strange grinding noise. The engine stuttered and lost power. Annoyed, Jack pulled to the side of the highway. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, inspecting the bike with growing frustration. A damaged chain had left him stranded, and his cell phone showed no signal. The scenic coastline that had seemed so inviting just moments before now felt isolated and unforgiving. Sometimes life forces you to stop so you can see what really matters. In the distance, Jack noticed a vehicle approaching, a battered 1972 Chevy C10 pickup. Waving his arms, he signaled for help. The truck slowed, its brakes squealing in protest, and came to a halt in front of him. The driver stepped out, revealing a woman who was decidedly unlike the glamorous vision Jack had pictured earlier. Practical and sturdy, she wore a simple denim shirt and work pants. Her hair was tied back in a no-nonsense ponytail, and her hands bore the calluses of someone who worked hard every day. "Trouble with your bike?" she asked in a calm, steady voice. Her name was Martha Green, a local mechanic who ran her own shop a few miles inland. Jack eyed her skeptically, struggling to reconcile her unassuming appearance with his need for help. "Yeah," he admitted grudgingly. "The chain's busted and I've got no cell signal. Can you help me get it to a shop?" Martha gave a small, confident smile. "Good thing I've got my tools with me. Let's load it into the truck. I'll take you to my place and fix it." Before Jack could respond, she was already unfolding a ramp from the bed of the Chevy. "Help me push," she instructed, positioning the bike. Despite his initial hesitation, Jack found himself following her lead. Together, they maneuvered the motorcycle into the truck bed with the aid of a manual winch. Martha secured it with practiced ease. "Where are we headed?" Jack asked, catching his breath. "Back to my shop in San Juan Creek. It's not far." The drive was quiet at first, save for the steady hum of the old truck's engine. Jack sat stiffly in the passenger seat, still digesting the situation. Martha, focused on the road, seemed unaffected by his aloof demeanor. The vast ocean views gave way to rolling hills dotted with oak trees as they moved inland. Eventually, Martha broke the silence. "So, where are you from?" she asked, her tone conversational but direct. "Everywhere," Jack replied with a hint of arrogance. "I'm a citizen of the world." Martha smirked, keeping her eyes on the road. "And where's this citizen of the world headed?" "Anywhere promising adventure," he answered, staring out the window. "And what kind of adventure were you expecting out here?" she asked, her voice carrying a playful edge. Jack chuckled. "I wouldn't say no to a Californian beauty to ride with. If you know any statuesque women with model looks, let me know. I pay well for good matchmaking services. He flashed her a self-satisfied grin, oblivious to how his words might land. Martha didn't flinch. She simply nodded. Noted. But sometimes the best company isn't the one you expect. Jack turned to her, sensing a quiet confidence in her response, but he chose not to reply. Instead, he focused on the winding road ahead, feeling a strange tension between irritation and curiosity about the woman sitting beside him. As the Chevy rattled along the rural road, Jack noticed the subtle details of his surroundings. A landscape untouched by the modern sprawl he was used to. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and oil from the truck. Martha's truck rolled to a stop outside a modest, yet well-maintained auto repair shop nestled among towering eucalyptus trees. The sign above the entrance read, "Martha's Auto Works." Martha hopped out of the cab and walked to the back of the truck. "Wait here while I get the ramp ready," she said briskly. Before Jack could object, she was already unloading the bike, her movements efficient and precise. Jack leaned against the truck, watching her work. "You own this place?" he asked, a faint note of incredulity in his voice. "Sure do," Martha replied without looking up. "My dad started it, and I took over after he retired." She straightened and gave him a pointed look. "Don't worry, I know my way around a Harley." Jack raised an eyebrow. "I hope so. That's not just any bike. It's a CVO Road Glide Limited, top of the line." Martha chuckled softly. "I know what it is, Cosmopolitan. Milwaukee 8117 engine, 125 pound-feet of torque. But let me guess, you noticed the chain giving you trouble just before the power cut out, right?" Jack's jaw tightened. "Yeah. How'd you know?" "Common issue," she replied matter-of-factly. "I've seen it before. These big engines pack a punch, but if the chain's even slightly out of alignment, it's only a matter of time." She nodded toward the shop. "Bring your ego inside, and we'll get started." Jack followed, his skepticism waning as he stepped into the shop. The space was a mix of order and chaos. Shelves, neatly stocked with tools, spare parts, and manuals, while a couple of disassembled engines lay scattered across workbenches. A large corkboard on the wall held photos of classic cars, motorcycles, and smiling customers, evidence of Martha's loyal clientele. "I hope you're not planning to experiment on my bike," Jack quipped, crossing his arms. Martha shot him a sideways glance. "Relax, Cosmopolitan. This isn't my first rodeo." She grabbed a wrench and a flashlight, sliding onto a creeper to inspect the underside of the bike. "You can sit or help, but no pacing around. It messes with my concentration." Jack grumbled something under his breath and perched on a nearby stool, watching as Martha methodically worked on his bike. Her hands moved with precision, and she occasionally muttered technical notes to herself as she assessed the damage. "So what brings a citizen of the world to this little corner of nowhere?" Martha asked after a while, her tone casual. "Adventure," Jack replied. "I've been all over Europe and Asia. Now I'm taking the U.S. by storm." Martha's voice floated out from beneath the bike. "And here I thought billionaires like you only cared about private jets and five-star resorts." Jack smirked. "Don't underestimate me, Martha. I can appreciate the simpler things, too." "Good to know," she replied dryly, sliding out from under the bike, "because this repair won't be cheap." Jack laughed to spite himself. "Touché." Martha straightened up, wiping her hands on a grease-stained rag. "Your chain's shot, but I've got a replacement in stock. Give me an hour, and you'll be back on the road." As she got back to work, Jack found his gaze lingering on her. There was something about her focus, her competence, that intrigued him. She was nothing like the women he usually sought out, yet her presence was grounding, even refreshing. When Martha finally finished, she tested the bike's engine, which roared back to life with its signature growl. "There you go," she said, stepping back with a satisfied smile. "Good as new." Jack inspected the bike, running his fingers along the polished surface. "You've got skills, I'll give you that," Martha smirked. "I'll take that as a compliment. Now, about the bill." Jack pulled out a leather wallet and handed her a few crisp bills. Martha held them up to the light, mock inspecting them for authenticity. "What? Don't trust me?" Jack teased. "Oh, I trust you, Cosmopolitan. I just like to make sure the money's as real as your bravado," she quipped, tucking the cash into her pocket. As Jack mounted his bike, he hesitated. "You know, Martha, you're full of surprises." "So are you, Jack," she replied with a wry smile. "Take care out there, and don't break the chain again. I won't always be around to bail you out." Jack laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet evening air. "Fair enough. Maybe I'll see you around, Martha." "Maybe," she said, waving as he rode off into the fading light. But even as the sound of his Harley faded, Martha found herself thinking about the unexpected encounter. Sometimes life throws people into your path for reasons you don't understand. Yet. Jack rode away from Martha's shop, the hum of his Harley cutting through the evening stillness. But something about the day clung to him, a nagging sense that he'd just met someone who didn't fit into his neatly compartmentalized world. The air was cool as he navigated back toward the coast. Yet, his thoughts were anything but clear. The next morning, Jack found himself at a small coastal cafe, sipping espresso and watching the waves roll in. He scrolled through his phone, catching up on work emails and messages. But his mind kept drifting back to Martha. Her confidence, her wit, the way she'd defied every expectation he had of her, it all lingered in his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir, would you like a refill?" The waitress's voice pulled him from his reverie. Jack glanced up, shook his head, and offered a polite smile. "No, thank you." As he returned to his phone, a soft chime interrupted him. A text message flashed on his screen from an unknown number. "Check your chain tension before your next ride. Safe travels." Martha. Jack stared at the screen, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. She's thorough, I'll give her that. He saved the number, labeling it simply as Martha. Meanwhile, back in San Juan Creek, Martha was busy as usual. Her shop was bustling with customers dropping off cars and bikes, but her mind kept wandering to Jack. She didn't often think twice about the strangers who came through her shop, but there was something about him. The mix of arrogance and vulnerability, his polished exterior masking something deeper. As the day wore on, her grandfather, Luis, called out from the kitchen, "Martha, come take a break. Lunch is ready." Martha wiped her hands on a rag and stepped into the cozy kitchen that adjoined the shop. Luis sat at the table, ladling soup into bowls. Despite his age, his sharp eyes sparkled with curiosity. "How's the business today, Nina?" he asked, setting down the ladle. "Busy, as always," Martha replied, sitting across from him. Luis leaned back, regarding her with a knowing smile. "You've been quiet. That usually means something's on your mind." Martha shrugged, trying to brush it off. "Just the usual. Fixing cars, dealing with people." Luis murmured, stirring his soup. After a pause, he added, "What about that biker from yesterday?" "He seemed interesting." Martha's head snapped up. "How'd you know about him?" Luis chuckled, his voice warm and gravelly. "Word gets around fast in a small town, Marta. And you don't usually spend half an afternoon fixing someone's ride without a reason." Martha sighed, half exasperated. "He's just another customer, abuelo." Luis's smile deepened. "Is that so? Well, sometimes strangers bring lessons we didn't know we needed." Martha gave him a sidelong glance, but she didn't argue. Instead, she let the conversation drift to other topics. Yet, as she worked through the afternoon, Luis's words stayed with her. That evening, Jack found himself unable to resist exploring San Juan Creek further. Something about the quiet town, the simplicity, the sense of community, felt strangely grounding. He parked his bike in the town square, wandering past quaint shops and diners. He had no particular destination in mind, but the thought of seeing Martha again nudged him forward. As he passed a small park, he heard the sound of laughter and looked over to see two young boys playing with a soccer ball. Their energy was infectious, and Jack couldn't help but smile. One of the boys kicked the ball too hard, sending it rolling toward Jack. "Hey, mister, can you kick it back?" one of them called. Jack picked up the ball and tossed it with a gentle throw. "There you go, kiddo." The other boy squinted at him. "Cool bike, mister. Is it yours?" Jack chuckled. "Yeah, it's mine. You like motorcycles?" Both boys nodded enthusiastically. Before Jack could say more, a familiar voice called out, "Liam, Toby, time to head home." Jack turned to see Martha walking toward the park. She froze for a moment when she spotted him, but quickly composed herself. "Well, well," she said, crossing her arms. "What brings you back here, cosmopolitan?" Jack smiled, gesturing to the town around him. "Just exploring. Didn't know I'd run into you and your crew." Martha rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "These are my boys," she said, nodding toward the kids. "Liam and Toby." Jack looked genuinely surprised. "Your kids didn't peg you as the motherly type." "Why, because I don't fit into your neat little stereotypes," she shot back, though her tone was more playful than biting. Jack raised his hands in mock surrender. "Fair point." The boys tugged on Martha's sleeve. "Mom, can we get ice cream before we go home?" Liam asked. Martha hesitated, glancing at Jack. "I suppose we can make a quick stop." Jack grinned. "Mind if I join? Ice cream sounds like a good way to end the day." Martha arched an eyebrow, but didn't object. Together they walked to a nearby ice cream stand, the boys chattering away about flavors, while Jack listened with an amused smile. As they sat on a bench enjoying their treats, Jack found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. The evening stretched into a quiet, pleasant calm as Jack sat on the bench with Martha and her boys. The warm glow of streetlights cast a soft haze over the small town square, and the sound of crickets filled the air. Liam and Toby, now sticky with melted ice cream, dashed off to play on a nearby jungle gym, their laughter echoing in the stillness. Jack leaned back, studying Martha as she watched her kids. There was a softness in her expression he hadn't seen before, a quiet pride and fierce love that made her seem entirely different from the no-nonsense mechanic who had put him in his place just hours earlier. "You're full of surprises, you know that?" Jack said, breaking the silence. Martha glanced at him. "Why? Because I have kids?" Jack shook his head. "Not just that. The shop, the way you handle yourself, your boys. You've built a whole life here. It's impressive." Martha smirked, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Well, not all of us can jet off around the world chasing adventure." "Touché," Jack admitted, smiling. "But I mean it. You seem grounded. Like you know exactly who you are and what matters." Martha tilted her head, considering him. "And you don't?" Jack hesitated, caught off guard. "I guess I've spent more time chasing what's next than figuring that out." Her gaze softened slightly, and she nodded toward the boys. "They keep me grounded. I don't have time to get lost in what-ifs. Every day is about making sure they're happy, safe, and ready to take on the world." Jack studied her, struck by the quiet strength in her words. For the first time in a long while, he felt a pang of envy, not for her life, but for the clarity with which she seemed to live it. The next morning, Jack awoke in a small roadside motel just outside San Juan Creek. The room was modest, a far cry from the luxury accommodations he was used to, but he found it surprisingly comfortable. After a quick shower, he packed his things and prepared to hit the road, yet as he straddled his Harley and revved the engine, he hesitated. Something about leaving felt incomplete. With a sigh, he turned the bike toward the town square instead of the highway. Martha's shop was already open when he arrived. She was under the hood of an old pickup, her hair tied back and her sleeves rolled up. She didn't notice him at first, and Jack took a moment to observe her, feeling a strange mix of admiration and nerves. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Morning, Martha." She looked up, a little surprised but not displeased. "Back already? Don't tell me you broke something else." Jack grinned. "Not this time. I just wanted to say thanks before I head out." Martha wiped her hands on a rag and stepped closer. "Well, you're welcome. Safe travels, Cosmopolitan. For a moment Jack just stared at her, as though trying to decide whether to say something more. Finally, he blurted out, "You ever think about seeing the world?" Martha blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "I mean it," Jack said, his voice steady now. "You've got the skill, the brains. You could go anywhere. Start a shop in a big city, travel, take your boys on the road." Martha laughed softly, shaking her head. "And leave this? The shop, my home, their school?" She gestured around her. "This is my world, Jack. It might not be flashy, but it's mine." Jack nodded slowly, though he couldn't entirely hide his disappointment. "I guess I just thought, I don't know, you'd want more." Martha fixed him with a level gaze. "Who says I don't already have more? Adventure doesn't always mean running off to some faraway place. Sometimes it's about building a life you're proud of, right where you are." Jack was silent for a moment, letting her words sink in. Finally he smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "You're something else, Martha Green. And don't you forget it," she said, grinning back. As Jack rode away from San Juan Creek later that day, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving more than just a small town behind. For the first time in years, he felt a strange tug, a longing not for the open road, but for something deeper, more lasting. And though he didn't know it yet, his path would cross with Martha's again. Life has a way of bringing people back together when they're least expecting it. The following week saw Jack back on the road, weaving through sprawling deserts, towering mountain passes, and bustling cities. Yet, no matter how far he traveled, his thoughts kept drifting back to San Juan Creek, back to Martha. Her sharp wit, her grounded perspective, and even the way she'd teased him. All of it lingered like an echo he couldn't shake. He tried to dismiss it as a fleeting infatuation, just another pit stop on his journey. But late at night, when the world around him was quiet, the memory of her laugh or the determination in her eyes would creep in. Jack began to wonder if the adventures he'd been chasing had always been hollow compared to the steady, authentic life Martha had built. In San Juan Creek, life carried on for Martha as usual. The shop was busier than ever, with locals and travelers alike bringing their vehicles for repairs. She barely had time to think about Jack, though when she did, it was with a mix of amusement and curiosity. Her boys, Liam and Toby, had taken an instant liking to him. They often asked if the fancy motorcycle guy would come back to visit. "Probably not," Martha would say with a shrug, though a small part of her wondered if she was wrong. One evening, as she was locking up the shop, her grandfather approached her. Don Luis leaned on his cane, his sharp eyes scanning her face. "You've been quieter than usual lately," he observed. "Just tired," Martha replied, brushing him off. Luis chuckled softly. "You know, it's okay to miss people, even if they're strangers." Martha looked up at him, startled by his insight. "Who says I miss anyone?" Luis's expression turned knowing. "Nina, I've been on this earth a long time. I know when someone's left an impression. That biker, what was his name? Jack? He's in your head, whether you admit it or not." Martha opened her mouth to protest, but stopped herself. Instead, she sighed. "He's just different, abuelo. He doesn't fit into this world." Luis smiled warmly. Sometimes it's the people who don't fit, who end up belonging the most. Weeks turned into a month before Jack finally gave in to the pull he felt. On a crisp autumn morning, he found himself retracing his steps back toward San Juan Creek. The winding road felt strangely familiar now, as if it were guiding him home. When he pulled up to Martha's shop, he was surprised to find it quieter than he remembered. The door was propped open, and the faint sound of a radio drifted out. Jack dismounted his Harley and stepped inside. Martha was at a workbench, tinkering with a carburetor. She didn't notice him at first, and Jack took a moment to observe her. She looked as focused as ever, her hands moving with practiced precision. "Need a mechanic, Cosmopolitan?" he asked, breaking the silence. Martha froze, her wrench pausing mid-turn. Slowly she turned around, her expression a mix of surprise and exasperation. "You again," Jack grinned. "Miss me?" "Hardly," she shot back, though her faint smile betrayed her. "What brings you back? Run out of roads to explore?" Jack stepped closer, his tone more serious. "I couldn't stop thinking about this place, about you." Martha raised an eyebrow, folding her arms across her chest. "And what exactly are you thinking, Jack?" Jack hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I've spent most of my life chasing the next big thrill, but nothing ever stuck. When I met you, I don't know, it was like I saw what I've been missing, something real." Martha stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally she sighed, setting down her wrench. "Jack, I'm not some adventure you can add to your list." "I know that," he said quickly. "I'm not here to sweep you off your feet or take you away from everything you've built. I want to get to know you. And if there's room in your world for someone like me, I'd like to try." Martha tilted her head, studying him. For all his bravado, there was a sincerity in his voice she couldn't ignore. "This world of mine isn't glamorous, Jack. It's messy and noisy and full of responsibility." Jack smiled. "Sounds perfect." For the first time, Martha laughed, shaking her head. "You're persistent. I'll give you that." "So is that a yes?" Jack asked, his grin widening. Martha rolled her eyes but couldn't hide her smile. "It's a we'll see. Now grab a wrench if you're staying. I've got work to do." Jack laughed, grabbing the nearest tool. As he joined her at the workbench, he couldn't help but feel like, for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was meant to be. Months later, Jack had become a regular fixture in San Juan Creek. He split his time between the open road and Martha's shop, learning the basics of auto repair and bonding with Liam and Toby over soccer games and ice cream runs. Martha, ever pragmatic, refused to label what they had, but Jack didn't mind. For the first time, he'd stopped chasing adventures and started living one, right where he was. As they stood side by side in the shop one evening, Martha handed Jack a set of keys. "What's this?" he asked. "Your next project," she replied with a smirk, nodding toward an old Harley in the corner. "If you're going to stick around, you might as well learn to rebuild one." Jack grinned, taking the keys. "You really know how to keep a guy on his toes." Martha smiled, her eyes soft. "Well, cosmopolitan, someone's got to." And as the sun set over San Juan Creek, Jack felt a contentment he'd never known before, a sense that his greatest adventure had only just begun. We humans often fear the absence of the body, forgetting that what truly matters, the love we've shared and the memories we've cherished, remains alive in a quiet corner of the soul. Life is like the ocean my best friend and I visited when we were young. Its waves retreat and vanish from sight, but they never stop being part of the vast, eternal sea. Those who leave us may disappear from our view, but they linger in the rhythm of the waves, in the whisper of the wind, and in the depths of our being, reminding us that what is eternal will always find its way back to us. Don Luis paused, letting his words settle in the room. The flickering lamplight cast a gentle glow, highlighting his weathered features, etched with years of wisdom. His voice softened as he continued, "Death doesn't extinguish the flame of those we love. It simply transforms it into a light we carry within." A reverent silence fell over the room, broken only by the faint rustle of the breeze slipping through the open window. Jorge sat still, as though something deep within him had finally been unburdened. Don Luis's words seemed to lift the weight he hadn't realized he carried, granting him a peace he hadn't felt in years. Marta, seated nearby, smiled faintly, her expression filled with a quiet understanding. She knew that love and memory were the invisible foundations of every family, a truth that had guided her through life's storms. Shortly afterward, Don Luis gave a nod of farewell, his frail figure swathed in a woolen blanket as Marta helped him to his room. The serenity on his face reflected the contentment of having shared a meaningful evening, one filled with memories and hopes that bridged the past and the present. Later that night, the moonlight spilled over the small terrace of the house, creating an intimate setting for Marta and Jorge, who stepped outside after settling the elder to rest. The fresh night air was alive with the gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of crickets. The twins, still brimming with energy, scampered toward Jorge, proudly showing off their toy cars. With a spontaneous laugh, Jorge dropped to the ground, sitting cross-legged to join the boys. Gone was the polished exterior of the wealthy traveler. In its place was a man rediscovering the pure joy of simplicity. From the terrace railing, Marta watched the scene unfold, her gaze softened by a mix of tenderness and surprise. A smile tugged at her lips, and a quiet sigh escaped her chest, a wave of emotion stirring within her that she couldn't yet name. Jorge's laughter mingled with the boys' excited voices, filling the night with a warmth that felt both unexpected and profound. Not long after, the twins began showing signs of fatigue, their boundless energy finally waning. Marta glanced at Jorge and said with a soft smile, "Time to get these two to bed." Jorge, his eyes gleaming with playful mischief, replied, "I'll help. I'm great at bedtime stories. So boring they'll fall asleep before I'm halfway through." Marta arched an eyebrow, momentarily taken aback by his humor, before nodding with a chuckle. Together they approached the boys, who were already dozing off on the terrace sofa. Marta carefully lifted one of the children into her arms, her maternal touch instinctive and tender. Jorge hesitated for a moment before picking up the other, surprised at how natural it felt to hold the small, trusting form against him. Following Marta, Jorge carried the boy to the twins' shared room, where two small beds waited. He gently laid the child down, tucking him under the covers with a care that felt both foreign and familiar. Marta did the same, and as they straightened up, their eyes met, a moment of unspoken understanding passing between them, before Marta flipped the light switch, leaving the room bathed in quiet shadows. As they stepped back into the night, Jorge spoke, his tone tinged with a sincerity Marta hadn't heard from him before. "I'd like to talk with you some more. The night is cool, and I have a few questions I can't stop thinking about." Marta smiled wryly, a flicker of humor dancing in her eyes. Well, a surprise exam. Didn't see that coming. I just hope your questions don't require a manual to answer." Laughing together, they made their way to the old wooden bench on the porch, its creak mingling with the gentle symphony of the night. Above them, a sky brimming with stars stretched endlessly. The faint scent of the nearby ocean carried on the breeze. Jorge exhaled, looking up at the constellations, then turned to Marta, who regarded him with curiosity and mild skepticism. "All right, Señor Cosmopolitan," she said with a smirk. "Go ahead." "First question, but fair warning, I didn't study for this." Jorge hesitated, his usual confidence softened by the intimacy of the moment. Finally he asked, "Where's the twins' father?" Marta's expression didn't waver. Her voice was steady, her words edged with a humor that barely concealed old pain. "He left to get a pack of cigarettes about 6 years ago. Must be circling the entire country by now, don't you think?" Jorge fell silent, the weight of her words stripping away the usual defenses he relied on. He turned his gaze toward the dark horizon, his chest tightening with an unfamiliar sense of guilt. "How could someone leave a woman like you?" he murmured, almost to himself. Marta gave a soft, bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Maybe for the same reasons you once thought made sense, Jorge." He believed what mattered was a perfect face, a perfect body. "I'm not thin or conventionally beautiful. I'm practical, grounded. And for someone like him, or someone like you once were, that's just not enough." She paused, her voice steady but tinged with a quiet vulnerability. "Last I heard, he ran off with someone younger, slimmer, with a face that could sell magazines. But you know what? I stopped caring a long time ago. Jorge felt heat rise to his cheeks, her words cutting through the facade he'd so carefully maintained for years. He'd spent a lifetime chasing illusions, judging worth through shallow standards. Now, for the first time, those choices felt small, almost shameful. "I didn't realize how blind I've been," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The admission surprised even him, the words carrying a sincerity he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Marta's expression softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Life has a way of opening our eyes, Jorge. The lessons aren't always pleasant, but they're never wasted." The night seemed to echo her wisdom. Above them the stars burned brighter, their light timeless and steady, as if silently affirming her truth. Jorge hesitated before speaking again. "Do you still love him? The twins' father, I mean. Do you wait for him? Do you even think about him?" Marta regarded him for a long moment, her gaze steady and thoughtful. "You're genuinely curious, aren't you?" she said, almost amused. When Jorge nodded, she sighed, leaning back on the bench. "I'll answer you, but only if you're ready to listen," she said, her tone gentle yet firm. "No, I don't love him anymore. I replaced my love for him with love for myself. I don't wait for him because I don't even remember him, not the person he became, at least. And you can't wait for someone who doesn't exist in your memory." Jorge leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as her words washed over him. He found himself asking, "What did you learn from it all? From everything you went through?" Marta tilted her head, her gaze lifting to the sky. After a moment of quiet, she replied, "I learned that the present moment is the only real thing we have. You have to hold on to it with an open heart, or it slips through your fingers. The future doesn't exist, and the past, it's just a story we tell ourselves. What matters is what we choose to do right now." Jorge smiled faintly, the respect he felt for her growing with each word she spoke. "You're an extraordinary woman," he said, his voice unusually soft. "Your strength, it's humbling." Marta laughed lightly, the sound tinged with both irony and kindness. "Maybe you're finally learning to see what's in front of you, Jorge," she replied, her eyes glinting with a playful challenge. "But now it's my turn to ask something. Answer honestly." Jorge straightened, curiosity flickering in his expression. "Go ahead," he said. "What do you want to know?" Marta leaned closer, her voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper. "Have you ever loved someone, truly loved them? Not the idea of them, not their beauty or their charm, but the very essence of who they are?" Jorge's immediate instinct was to say yes. He opened his mouth, then hesitated, her piercing gaze unraveling the excuses forming in his mind. "I've thought so," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "But now, I'm not sure." Marta smiled, though it wasn't unkind. "Let me rephrase," she said. "Have you ever loved someone in a way that made the world disappear? The kind of love where their soul feels like a mirror to your own. The kind that no distance, no time, and no circumstance can break." Jorge sat back, stunned into silence. He ran a hand through his hair, grappling with the weight of her question. "No," he said at last, the admission raw and unguarded. "I don't think I have." Marta studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "You'd know if you had," she said simply. "How?" Jorge asked, his voice almost desperate. "How would I know?" Marta's smile returned, gentler this time. "Through the mirror," she said, her voice as steady as the stars above them. Jorge frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to grasp her meaning. "What mirror?" Marta leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "The mirror of your soul," she explained. "When you look at someone and see not just who they are, but who you are reflected back at you, that's when you know." Jorge fell silent, her words resonating in a way that left him disarmed. He lowered his gaze, staring at the worn planks of the porch beneath their feet. "If that's what love is," he said slowly, "then no. I've never felt that. I've never allowed myself to." The night enveloped them in a gentle hush, the sounds of the crickets and rustling leaves filling the space between their words. Marta turned her gaze to the sky, her posture calm but thoughtful. Jorge, for once, didn't rush to fill the silence. He let her presence and the weight of her words settle into him. The soft rustling of the night wind played through the air as Marta and Jorge sat in the stillness. The wooden bench creaked faintly beneath them, the stars above seeming to listen intently to the truths shared between two souls who, until recently, had been strangers. Marta broke the silence, her voice calm but curious. "Why do you think you've never let yourself feel that kind of love, Jorge? What are you afraid of?" Jorge hesitated, his fingers nervously tracing the grain of the wood beneath him. "I think I've been chasing an idea," he admitted. "A version of perfection that doesn't exist. It's safe. No one can hurt you if you never let them see who you really are." Marta tilted her head, her gaze steady but kind. "And has it worked? Has hiding from real connection kept you from feeling pain?" Jorge gave a rueful chuckle, shaking his head. It's just made me feel hollow. Like I've been collecting shiny objects, but never finding anything that truly matters." Her lips curved into a soft smile, her tone gentle yet firm. "Sometimes you have to let go of what you think you need to find what you truly do. And often, it's not out there somewhere. It's right in front of you." The night deepened around them, the weight of their conversation shifting into a more comfortable quiet. A shooting star streaked across the sky, drawing both their gazes upward. "Look at that," Jorge murmured, his voice almost reverent. "A reminder of how fleeting everything is." "Not everything," Marta replied, her tone thoughtful. "Some things leave a mark that lasts forever." Jorge turned to her, his expression contemplative. "You've left a mark on me, Marta. I don't know how or why, but I feel like meeting you has changed something in me." Marta's smile was faint but genuine. "Maybe that's because you're finally letting yourself be real, Jorge. The rest is just noise." The next morning dawned bright and crisp, sunlight streaming through the curtains in Don Luis's room. The old man, with a spark of youthful mischief in his eyes, called out to Marta and Jorge as they sipped coffee in the kitchen. "I've made a decision," Don Luis declared as they entered his room. His tone carried the unmistakable weight of conviction. "I want to go to the beach today. It's been too long since I felt the sand beneath my feet or the sea breeze on my face." Marta exchanged a surprised glance with Jorge, who grinned in response. "Sounds like a plan," Jorge said enthusiastically. "I'll help get him into the truck." The twins, overhearing the conversation, erupted into cheers, their excitement filling the house with energy. Within an hour they were packed into the old Chevrolet C10, with Jorge leading the way on his Harley. The caravan wound through the countryside, the scent of salt and the distant roar of waves growing stronger with each passing mile. They arrived at a quiet stretch of beach, the golden sand stretching out before them like a promise. Don Luis, propped in a chair under the shade of a large umbrella, gazed out at the ocean with a contented smile. "This," he said softly, "is where life feels infinite." The twins splashed in the shallow waves, their laughter a melody that mingled with the rhythm of the sea. Jorge joined them, his polished boots forgotten as he waded barefoot into the water, lifting the boys into the air and spinning them around as they shrieked with joy. Marta watched from the shore, a rare sense of peace washing over her. Jorge's transformation was undeniable, and for the first time she allowed herself to wonder if this man, so different from when he'd first arrived, could truly be part of her world. As Jorge returned to the shore, dripping and grinning, he flopped onto the sand beside her, catching his breath. "You should join us," he teased. "It's surprisingly liberating," Marta smirked. "I'll stick to observing, thanks." Jorge turned to her, his expression softening. "Thank you for this, Marta, for all of it. I've been to beaches all over the world, but this one feels different." Marta glanced at him, her voice quiet. "Maybe because you're finally present. You're not just passing through, Jorge. You're living." As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting the beach in hues of gold and orange, Don Luis called them over. "Jorge," he said, his voice low but steady, "the greatest journeys aren't the ones you take with your feet. They're the ones you take with your heart. I hope you carry this moment with you, no matter where you go." Jorge nodded, his throat tightening. "I will. I promise." The drive back was quiet, the twins dozing in the back seat of the truck as the last light of day faded into night. When they reached the house, Jorge lingered by his motorcycle, a sense of finality settling over him. Don Luis was the first to approach him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Follow the road that calls you," he said. "But remember, the best maps are written in the heart." The twins clung to Jorge, their small arms wrapping around him tightly. "Will you come back?" one asked, his voice sleepy but hopeful. Jorge crouched to meet the boy's gaze. "I don't know when," he said honestly, "but I promise this is a place I'll always want to return to." Marta stood a few steps away, her arms crossed as she tried to mask the emotions swirling within her. "Take care of yourself, Jorge," she said simply, "and don't forget what you've learned here." Jorge approached her, his voice quiet but firm. "I could never forget you, Marta. Not now, not ever." Without another word, he climbed onto his Harley and started the engine. The roar filled the air as he pulled away, the family watching until he disappeared into the distance. As Jorge rode away, the familiar hum of his Harley filled his ears, but this time it didn't bring the same thrill it once had. The open road stretched ahead, offering freedom and adventure, yet his heart felt tethered to the small house he'd just left behind. He tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on the winding road and the crisp air. But every turn seemed to echo with laughter. Every mile brought back the warmth of Marta's voice or the glint of mischief in her eyes. Even the twins' giggles and Don Luis's wise words lingered like a melody he couldn't escape. Stopping at a gas station to refuel, Jorge leaned against the pump and stared at the horizon. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the empty stretch of highway. The thought struck him like a bolt. What am I running from this time? Back at the house, Marta stood on the porch long after Jorge had gone, her arms wrapped around herself against the cooling evening air. The twins were asleep, and Don Luis had retired to his room, but Marta's thoughts were far from restful. She gazed out at the road, half expecting to see Jorge's motorcycle appear again, its rumble breaking the quiet. Why do I feel like something unfinished just walked out of my life, she wondered. Shaking her head, she turned and stepped back inside, trying to push away the ache that had settled in her chest. Over the following weeks, Jorge tried to immerse himself in the life he'd built for himself, luxury, freedom, and adventure. But no matter where he went or what he did, the emptiness persisted. The scenic vistas he once reveled in felt dull, the vibrant cities muted. Even the camaraderie of strangers on the road couldn't fill the void. One evening, seated in a high-end hotel overlooking the bright lights of a bustling city, Jorge found himself staring into the mirror in his room. For the first time, he didn't see the polished, confident man he had always tried to be. Instead, he saw someone searching for a connection, a place to belong. And then, in his mind's eye, Marta appeared. Her words echoed in his memory. Sometimes, the best things aren't out there somewhere. They're right in front of you. Jorge stood abruptly, his decision made. Grabbing his keys and jacket, he left the hotel and headed for the garage. Within moments, the familiar roar of his Harley filled the air as he tore through the city streets, his only thought to return to the place that now felt like home. Back in San Juan Creek, life continued quietly. Marta kept busy with the shop, her days filled with repairs, invoices, and the chatter of customers. Don Luis, though slower now, still enjoyed sitting outside and sharing stories with the twins, who often peppered him with questions about their adventurous friend. "Do you think he'll come back?" Toby asked one afternoon, his voice tinged with hope. Don Luis smiled gently, his eyes distant. "Sometimes the people meant to stay in our lives find their way back, no matter how far they've wandered." Marta overheard the conversation from the garage, her heart tightening. She hadn't let herself dwell on Jorge's departure, but the boy's words stirred something she couldn't quite suppress. Would he come back, she wondered? And if he did, what would it mean? Weeks later, as the sun dipped low on another tranquil evening, the familiar rumble of a motorcycle echoed through the valley. Marta paused mid-task, her hand stilling as recognition dawned. She stepped out of the garage, her breath catching as Jorge's Harley came into view, its sleek frame glinting in the fading light. Jorge pulled to a stop in front of the house, his heart racing. He dismounted slowly, his eyes locking with Marta's. For a moment neither of them spoke, the air between them heavy with unspoken emotion. "You're back," Marta said finally, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying her surprise. "I couldn't stay away," Jorge admitted, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. "I tried. I thought I could keep moving, keep chasing. But I realized the only place I want to be is here, with you." Marta crossed her arms, her gaze searching his face. "And what exactly does here mean to you, Jorge? Is it just another stop on your endless journey, or something more?" "It's everything," he said without hesitation. "You're everything, Marta. You and the boys, Don Luis. All of you showed me what it means to feel alive, to belong. I've spent my life running, and I don't want to run anymore." Marta's expression softened, her arms falling to her sides. "Words are easy, Jorge. What are you willing to do to prove it?" Jorge stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm not just here to prove anything. I'm here to stay, if you'll have me." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint rustling of the trees. Finally Marta sighed, a smile breaking across her face. "Well," she said, her voice tinged with humor, "I guess the twins will be happy to see you. And Don Luis, he always did like you." Jorge laughed, the tension draining from his body. "Does that mean I've passed your test?" Marta chuckled, shaking her head. "Not yet, but you're off to a decent start." That evening, as the stars filled the sky once again, Jorge found himself sitting on the porch beside Marta, the twins fast asleep and Don Luis inside with a book. The air was cool, and the soft hum of crickets provided a soothing backdrop. "Do you think I'll ever really belong here?" Jorge asked, his voice quiet. Marta turned to him, her gaze steady. "Belonging isn't about where you are, Jorge. It's about who you choose to be. And if you're willing to show up, really show up, then you'll find your place here." Jorge nodded, her words settling deep in his chest. For the first time, he felt a sense of peace, a certainty that he'd found not just a place, but a purpose. And as the night stretched on, the road ahead no longer seemed like a path to somewhere else. It felt instead like the beginning of something new, something lasting.